of course, anything that is seen to undermine NATO unity will also risk to undermine NATO deterrence. So if there are any doubts, any concerns about whether the United States will come to the defense of other allies should they come under attack, that, of course, will send a message of unclarity and a message that perhaps NATO is not as strong, as united as it needs to be to deter an adversary like Russia, for instance.
Now, NATO chief Mark Rutte will meet Keir Starmer at Downing Street today to discuss the alliance's new 5% defence spending target. The plan, which is due to be set out at a summit later this month, mirrors Donald Trump's call for Europe to pull its weight on defence. But with government coffers already stretched and their own public spending review due to be published this week, does Rutte have any chance of persuading Starmer to spend even more on the military? Well, Oana Lungescu was NATO's longest-serving spokesperson and is now a distinguished fellow at RUSI, and she joins us now. Oana, good morning.
Good morning from Brussels.
Good morning. Good morning to Brussels. Thanks very much for being with us. Look, you used to be in charge of NATO's messaging. How does NATO go about trying to get its members to do what NATO wants?
Well, of course, NATO works by consensus. So all the allies, and right now there are 32 of them, have to agree on something for that to happen. And the Secretary General can't constrain them to do anything they don't want to, because, of course, decisions about defense and security are ultimately in the hands of national governments, and because they are decisions about life and death. They're really absolutely at the heart of national sovereignty. But the Secretary General does have, if you will, the power of the pulpit. So what he does, and that's exactly what Mark Rutte is doing now, he's going around the capital and he's constantly on the phone with heads of state and government to make sure that they're all aligned and that there are no surprises when they get to the Hague summit on the 24th and 25th of June in just a few days, actually.
I mean, so NATO, like almost by definition, always wants more money. Donald Trump has been, he's had this sort of mixed position on NATO. On the one hand, he's been quite dismissive of NATO, almost seemed to threaten the future of NATO. But then on the other hand, he has definitely called for other NATO members to provide NATO with more money, or at least more spending on their own defence. What would NATO's approach towards Trump be right now? Are they slightly grateful for his interventions, or do they worry about them?
Well, both, I would say, because on the one hand, of course, anything that is seen to undermine NATO unity will also risk to undermine NATO deterrence. So if there are any doubts, any concerns about whether the United States will come to the defense of other allies should they come under attack, that, of course, will send a message of unclarity and a message that perhaps NATO is not as strong, as united as it needs to be to deter an adversary like Russia, for instance. On the other hand, it's true that this very clear, sometimes brutal message from Donald Trump about defense spending has had an effect. We have to remember also that this is not a new message from Washington. It actually goes back to President Eisenhower, President Kennedy, President Obama, who called Europeans free riders, and of course President Biden and Trump during his first term. And what we have seen, the good news, if you will, is that since 2014, since NATO allies agreed at the Wales summit that they would spend at least 2% of GDP on defense, 23 out of the 32 allies have actually done that, with many, starting with Poland, but also the UK, of course, spending more than 2% of GDP on defense. The message from Trump has been, that's been a win for me. What I told NATO to do, it's done. However, that's not enough. And there he's not wrong. And that's also why Mark Rutte is going around European capital and is talking to Sir Keir Starmer in Downing Street today, saying the world is much too dangerous. We need to do more. And that's why the 5% of GDP on defense, a target which Donald Trump launched during his election campaign last year, which seemed, frankly, rather unrealistic last year, is now becoming the center of an emerging consensus within NATO. And that 5% of GDP on defense, of course, is made up of two bits. It's a bit complicated, but bear with me. It's 3.5% on core defense capabilities, and a further 1.5% of GDP on defense-related things such as cyber defense, but also stronger infrastructure, roads, airports, airfields, ports, to allow for reinforcement if needed.
We talk a lot about the figure, the percentage of GDP. As one of my correspondents pointed out this morning, 3% of British GDP is obviously worth a lot more than perhaps 5% of Polish GDP. Does NATO, does the Secretary General of NATO have to be a little bit careful in sort of shaming nations and trying to shame nations who aren't matching the figure when perhaps they're sort of, in real terms, their contributions are actually considerable?
I think the aim of the Secretary General is usually not to name and shame, but to name and praise. And that's certainly the case for the UK, which has been a leader in terms of defense spending for many years. And it's been a leader in NATO also in many different ways, obviously as a nuclear power, but also leading the NATO battle group in Estonia, a strong supporter of Ukraine with an important maritime command in Northwood. So there is a lot to praise Britain for. At the same time, I would expect Mark Rutte to tell the Prime Minister that it's important that Britain maintains that leadership by example. It's obviously important for NATO because the UK is at the heart of NATO, but it's also important for the UK because NATO is, if you wish, the biggest international platform that the UK has to project its power and influence after it's left the European Union. So I would say it's a message, it's a mixed message saying it's great what you've been doing so far, but we also need Britain to continue leading by example by committing itself in a clearer way to investing 3.5% of GDP on defense plus 1.5%, so basically 5% of GDP on defense. So that because it would also be rather awkward if, having decided that its defense is NATO first, with NATO at the heart of British defence in the Strategic Defence Review just the other week, it would be a bit awkward if the UK were to lag behind in this commitment, along with countries such as Spain, which, for instance, are spending the least of their GDP on defence in Europe.
Finally, Oana, in meetings and negotiations like the ones taking place today, how much should we understand Mark Rutte, or indeed any NATO chief, as being their own man, and to what extent are they an avatar for what they're being told to do by the Americans, by Donald Trump specifically?
Well, obviously the US is the biggest ally in NATO, and without the US, NATO would have very little meaning. In many ways, in President Trump, we sometimes have an audience of one. So, for instance, I remember back in 2019 with Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg, Mark Rutte's predecessor, we went to the United States and did a single interview with Fox News with a single figure, which was $100 billion, showing that was by how much NATO allies had increased their defense spending as a result of Trump's messaging. So I would expect that Mark Rutte would, on the one hand, need to focus on Trump's message and also to convey to Trump the money, the figure, how much NATO allies are investing more in defense, while also to the Europeans having to send a more complex message about why that money needs to be spent, on what. And I think that's exactly what Rutte will be doing in the UK today, because he's not only meeting the Prime Minister, he's also giving a speech at Chatham House, explaining that we need a quantum leap in defence, and also going to Sheffield Forgemasters together with the Defence Secretary to look at the new investments, so to look at the defence dividend, if you will, and how that will further help growth and jobs in the UK.
Thank you very much indeed, Oana Lungescu. And Oana was NATO's longest-serving spokesperson and is now a distinguished fellow at RUSI.